Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 27th audio chat on the Q News Patriot Rumble channel series. I'm the Q News Patriot, coming to you today with Mr. Scott Schara. My name is SG Anon. As we move through this process in this great awakening journey and people come to realize the machinations of society that have been at play in the background for a very long time, it is so important to correlate the present times and the present events with the things of the past, the setup, the scaffolding, the foundation laying, and the infrastructure laying for not only worldwide biological terrorism, worldwide treason against election systems and selection processes, and also medical murder. We've discussed a couple of different things on this program discussing medical murder and the hospital protocols of the COVID-19 lockdown period of time. We've also talked extensively about the basis for biological terrorism going back as many as 50 to 60 years. Some very good research out there suggests, of course, much longer. And no one, I think, is more qualified in these discussions and in these brainchild meetings that happen amongst we the people in this process than those who have experienced many of these topics firsthand and have thrown wholeheartedly their livelihoods into unearthing just how deep and dark the rabbit hole really goes. Mr. Schara is here to share a testimonial about his personal experience with hospital malfeasance and organized medical murder, and also the research that he has found in this fight for humanity and in this fight for our very existence that sets the basis for the antithesis of what healthcare really is, and also the overall design of the healthcare system worldwide that has been implemented over the last 50 years. And as you might expect, it has very little to do with health. Mr. Schara, thank you for joining us today on QNP.
Well, thanks for having me. It's quite a gift to be here. You in your open, you mentioned the last 50 years. And once I give the perspective as to what happened to my beautiful daughter, Grace, I want to go all the way back to 120 years, because that's what my research has shown. It goes that far back. And it's a real sick and sad story about our nation's history. And I'm thankful to have the opportunity to share it. So thank you.
Well, we're very grateful to have you here, and I'm certainly extremely honored that you would spend some time today. I know that you're a very busy man on a very important mission, a personal calling of your own. And actually, that's where I'd like to start. You said that you came to this fight not that long ago. You had a wonderful daughter that was exposed to the medical malfeasance system and unfortunately is no longer with us. Could you give us a background as to how you arrived here at this point and then where that led?
Well, just to start with, I was not awake to anything relative to this agenda before my daughter Grace died. Grace was 19. She had Down syndrome. She was the love of our life. God gave us a lot of gifts, but she was second. She was the second most important gift that he ever gave us, second to salvation. And her Down syndrome, most people would think, well, somebody with Down syndrome, boy, they're a burden. Well, she was the life of the party. And I miss her immensely. She's an easy reason to jump in this fight, but to keep it going, praise God that he's opened up door after door after door. Just a quick, I'll give you just a quick story about Grace, because, she loved everybody to start with. I mean, she was very high functioning. I taught her how to drive a car. She deer hunted with me. She played violin. She could public speak. She told jokes, and she saw things. And what I mean by that is she saw the humor in things. So in our area, there's a regional grocery chain called Piggly Wiggly, and their jingle is "Shop the Pig." So Grace and I are driving in the truck one day, SG, and the jingle comes on, and she said, "Dad, I don't get it. How do you shop a pig? First you shoot the pig, then you eat the pig, but you don't shop the pig." It's like, oh my gosh, I love that kind of humor. And she got it. It was she was an absolute joy. So as we get into what happened, the scene was October of 2021. To give you a perspective of our mentality, I've always considered myself a conservative. I've owned a business for over half of my life. So business has dominated my thought process. And so I had a healthy distrust for the government, but I didn't realize they were completely corrupt. We had never vaccinated Grace with anything. So we were wise to the vaccine agenda, not necessarily from the perspective of drilling down that vaccines have never been tested, but from the perspective of trusting in God versus trusting in man. So Grace was never vaccinated. I believe that's part of the reason she was very high functioning. Of course, God made her that way, and my wife did a fantastic job homeschooling her also. But now we get into the supposed pandemic, the scamdemic, and we had been influenced at least partially by the propaganda, the fear porn. And when October of 21 came around, we had tested Grace with a home COVID test. Yeah, and of course that was a big mistake because the test, we just assumed COVID was real at that time. We assumed the test was accurate. Of course, Grace tested positive. Well, then we started her on protocols that were from the FLCCC, the Frontline Critical COVID Care Doctors. And so she was on ivermectin, vitamins, basically everything. I thought we were well prepared. The tool that we bought to measure her oxygen is called a pulse ox, and that was, I thought was an important tool. As I realize now in hindsight, I see that, when a person has cold or flu, their oxygen saturation drops. And so to drop into the 80s is common. Well, the morning of October 6th, Grace dropped to 88%, and the fear took over. The protocol said if your oxygen saturation drops below 94%, admit yourself to the hospital. So we did that. And 7 days later, Grace was dead. What's unique about what happened in our case is that we were in the hospital. I was with Grace from October 6th until the 10th. I was taken out by an armed guard on the 10th. We had 47 hours without advocacy, and I had to hire an attorney to get my daughter Jessica in as a replacement advocate. My wife Cindy couldn't do it at that point because she was sick, presumably with, I don't know anymore, but we presumed COVID at that time. Anyway, we were in the room, and then Grace, outside of that 47 hours, we were in the room, but then Grace was never given remdesivir and never put on a ventilator, which is the classic situation with most of these deaths that happened during the 39-month COVID era. So that really got me digging into what happened. And I'm going to connect the dots after I share the details of how they murdered her. So when we didn't have advocacy, the 47 hours without advocacy, now we've overlaid, of course, the hospital records with the timelines because of the lawsuit. And we find that the day before I was taken out by the armed guard, they started Grace on a sedation med called Precedex. Precedex has a warning on its package insert that says to not use that drug for more than 24 hours. If you do, it causes acute respiratory failure. And if you look at Grace's death certificate, the first cause of death is the truth. They listed acute respiratory failure with hypoxemia. So there's a direct cause and effect from the doctor prescribing this med. And he did it we turned the page to October 13th, Grace's last day on earth. She has already been on that med for 4 full days. The medical malpractice nurse who reviewed Grace's record said that they chemically restrained Grace with Precedex to set up her death. Well, now we're into the 13th. The doctor called my wife Cindy and I at home that morning. And the purpose of his call was to ask us for a pre-authorization to put Grace on a ventilator just in case. This was the 5th request. And this just in case, they would frame the discussion, SG, to kind of get you to think that they're on your side. He said these type of things tend to happen in the middle of the night when we can't get a hold of the family, so we'd like your pre-authorization. Well, I went into the hospital with Grace under the premise that then President Trump had said that we have a ventilator shortage. So I thought ventilators were simply a tool in the toolbox. As I researched ventilators while Grace was in the hospital, I was with her. And then once I was kicked out afterward, I found out, wow, ventilators should never be used at all with COVID as a diagnosis. It's not a proper tool. And in fact, it has a 90% kill rate. So we said no each of those times, knowing these facts. And that morning we said no again. As I found out with subsequent research, a ventilator is a key motivation for the hospital to get the patient on the ventilator. And the reason is not only was and still is the government is incentivizing ventilators, but the payday for a ventilator, once a hospital convinces the patient or their family to put the patient on a ventilator, is about $300,000. So there's a huge financial motivation to push in a tool that has a 90% kill rate. Anyway, so now we're on this phone call with the doctor that morning. And after we said no, he immediately switched gears and said, well, Grace had such a good day yesterday, which surprisingly she did. And we knew because my daughter Jessica was in the room. He said, Grace had such a good day yesterday. Let's work on nutrition. Let's get her out of bed so we can get her home in the next 3 or 4 days. Well, it was a complete lie relative to getting her out of bed, because we found out he had actually strapped Grace down to the bed and made her defecate in the bed before the call. While we were on the call with him, he increased the Precedex to the maximum allowable dose. Simultaneous with hanging up the call, he put an illegal do not resuscitate order on Grace's chart and then proceeded to kill her throughout the day. They combined, through his order, Precedex with lorazepam and morphine, which is what you do to euthanize somebody in their last hour of hospice care. And that med combination is in fact what killed Grace. When it came time to revive her, the nurses refused to even come in the room, using the excuse, we were on a FaceTime call at this point and screaming, save our daughter. And they only hollered back from outside the room, SG, she's DNR. We screamed back, she's not DNR, save our daughter. And they refused. And we watched her die at 7:27 p.m. on October 13th, 2021, on a FaceTime call with my daughter Jessica in the room. That combination of events ultimately led to the research where I realized, why would they euthanize her? And the answers to those questions are what we can talk about next. But I gave kind of a long story. I want to make sure you have time to ask a question in between.
My friend, I could come up with a number of different questions, I think, but as I sit here listening to this, I find myself absolutely floored by the level of gall and the level of disconnected sociopathy that must be present inside the medical industrial complex for these types of events to have occurred. Because what you have described just now had nothing to do with COVID-19. It had nothing to do with the organized death protocol from Fauci that we all are very well aware of at this point, right? All of us affected by this in one way or another. Many organizations highlighting out that it was, in fact, the Fauci protocol. It was, in fact, the FDA, CDC regulations and recommendations that led to organized medical mass murder.
Right.
But what you have just described is a tangential issue off of that very topic, which is the organized medical mass murder being incentivized in all of the different realms, in all of the different vectors. And really, it amounts to, I think, a silent war being waged on the population, not only of the United States, but on any Western world nation that employs this type of healthcare approach, this type of lens on medical wellness and health. So, I think at this point, I'd like to just let you continue through this story, because I think I'm going to have a number of questions as we move forward.
Well, you're right on. It is silent, and how they pulled this off, the silence was implemented. Yeah, I call it programming. They programmed us, and they programmed us first to accept the Hippocratic Oath. And so we believe, I don't believe it anymore because I've studied it, but going into a hospital, we think it's a safe zone. Why? Because we've been programmed that the doctor has signed as part of a condition of employment, the Hippocratic Oath, and then that has been boiled down to meaning do no harm. Well, if you look at the Hippocratic Oath and you read it, you see that it is an oath to satanic gods. So it cannot be an oath that, even if they did take the oath, it's not real. But we've been programmed to believe this. So we think hospitals are safe zones. Well, everybody knows a hospital isn't a place to get well. I mean, it's kind of a joke, but it is. And you think that the doctors are generally arrogant, and that's also generally true. But you don't realize that there is actually an agenda to reduce the population through the medical care facilities. I'm putting care in air quotes. So how did this even happen? And I said, after you're open, I want to go back about 120 years, because that's when the current eugenics movement was started by the United States through sterilization programs. Adolf Hitler adopted our eugenics protocols at the time. During World War II, of course, we do what we do the best of any nation, which is shake our finger at everybody else while we're committing a greater sin. So then through Operation Paperclip, while we're shaking our finger at Adolf Hitler, we bring over the top 1,600 German eugenicists to the United States. And they really take the time to perfect the eugenics mentality. And what COVID did, if you're paying attention, it has nothing to do with COVID. COVID exposed the agenda to anybody who is awake. And I'm awake because of COVID. And I'm trying to share and shout from the rooftops that it had nothing to do with COVID. This was systematically planned by design over 120 years. So now let's just talk about how do they pull something like this off? And I want to just jump ahead and then go backwards. So they have to convince us of a mentality. And, us, I'm talking about society in general. So they've convinced us of a mentality called collectivism. So we have to do what's good for the population instead of what's good for the individual. And Grace, of course, had Down syndrome, which means she was disabled. The disabled and the elderly were the number one and number two causes of death during the 39-month COVID era. Being disabled and elderly is not a comorbidity, so it doesn't make any sense. But what does make sense, if you understand the spirit of collectivism, is that there's 135 million Americans on Medicare and Medicaid, and they have convinced us that it's too expensive, that the cost for those 135 million Americans is $3 trillion a year. That's 50% of the annual federal budget. So these people are too expensive, and so we've got to get rid of them. When Obamacare was passed on March 23rd of 2010, that codified the agenda that Ezekiel Emanuel publicly stated in 1996. He said that non-contributing members of society don't deserve medical care. And so COVID simply exposed what has been put in place legally. So they crossed every T, dotted every I, to reduce those specific population groups. It's much bigger than that, but that's the population groups they went after first. All right, well, how did they pull that off? And so the spirit of collectivism has got an underlying mentality. Have you, SG, have you heard of Hannah Arendt before? Is her name familiar to you?
The name is familiar, but I can't connect it directly right at the moment. Could you refresh me, please?
Yes. So she studied the Adolf Eichmann trial from World War II, and she couldn't wrap her head around how could this happen? How could everybody be in on it with respect to World War II? And so she coined this phrase, banality of evil. So banality means commonplace. So evil was so common that people didn't even recognize it. Yeah, so the gas chambers in Nazi Germany were the end game. That was facilitated first by the first people taken out were the disabled a decade before the gas chambers, followed by the elderly. And ultimately people kind of just went along with this. And so what does that look like in the United States? And I'm going to be very specific with the disabled, and specifically Down syndrome. Down syndrome children are murdered at the rate of 90% in the womb in the United States of America. Well, how is it possible? Well, it's possible through this banality of evil. So they do it by the young couple. I'll just give you an example to prove the point. The young couple comes in to the doctor's office. He says, "Congratulations on your pregnancy. I'd like to schedule your amniocentesis." So what's the purpose of that? I mean, they don't even ask a question. The only question that's on their mind is, does my insurance cover it? And so, yes, he said, your insurance covers this. Okay, well, why does the insurance cover it? Well, the insurance covers it because they're in on this. They need to eliminate the disabled population before they're born. That's their best opportunity. So now the amniocentesis results come in. They have the second meeting with the doctor, and he says, "We suspect your son is going to have Down syndrome. I recommend an abortion." And these young people have no roots because the public school system has trained out any idea of responsibility. So they have no way to, they just blindly trust the doctor. So that's why 90% of Down syndrome babies are aborted before they're ever born. So that's the banality of evil relative to the disabled. Just everybody's participating in these murders without even realizing they're doing it. Okay, well, what about the elderly? Well, the elderly, if you go back to 1960, it was almost unheard of to have nursing homes or dementia centers. Now mom misses the mail one day and the kids just want to ship her off to a dementia center or a nursing home instead of taking her in their home. Back in, when I was a kid, everybody took care of their parents. Now almost nobody does. So out of sight, out of mind, the elderly are put away in nursing homes. Statistically, during COVID, the number of elderly who died in nursing homes versus elderly who were outside of nursing homes was 10 times higher. So you can see what's going on is that through this spirit of collectivism, the costs are out of control. There has been a 216 time 20,000% increase since 1960 to 2019 in the cost of Medicare and Medicaid. And so these costs are out of control. Of course, that's a complete lie because we have a fiat currency. They can print money to do anything that they want, and they do. But when it comes to the elderly and disabled, the eugenics agenda says we've got to eliminate those population groups. And those, as I'm trying to connect the dots, that these are the first to go. When you look at this through the lens of what is going on with the entire population reduction agenda, the best advice I can give anybody paying attention is to look through the lens that you're next, because then you can be prepared for what is coming. So that's a very long explanation, but I hope it connects the dots with people as to why I say this has been going on for 120 years.
I'm going to ask sort of a dumb question here, but I want to drive home a point, I think, for the audience, especially first time or second time listeners that are coming onto a chat like this, and maybe they're awakening, as you described just a moment ago, for the first time over these last couple of years to what is really at play. The dynamics, the shadow movement in our institutions, within our societal arenas, within the sectors of society that we interact with and do business with and rely upon and like to think that we have some sort of safety, security, and control of. Do you feel, and based on your research, is it a reasonable conclusion of any kind to say that this is an organized depopulation template that is being used not only here in the Western world, in North America, for example, but all around the rest of the planet as a result of COVID-19?
Well, I think it's very much organized. If you just drill down COVID, I mean, there's so much evidence for, people who are awake, you're digging into this and you see, well, there's so much evidence that COVID was a complete psyop. Just to start with, there was no pandemic. Okay, so we just start with that as a premise. But then there's also the virus has never been isolated. So, I would say almost with certainty there was no virus. And the hospital murders, Grace died in the fourth quarter of 2021. That quarter, just to give people a perspective, that was the highest quarter of hospital murders during COVID. What was the reason? Well, the reason is because the Brooke Jackson case had already exposed that the vaccine that they were trying to get in everybody's arm was a bioweapon. January of 21, that lawsuit was exposed. The government already admitted in May of 21 that the supposed vaccine was going to cause myocarditis. So now we're in the fourth quarter of 21. The individual family practitioners, SG, were incentivized to the tune of $296,000 a piece if they could convince 70% of their patient populations to get the jab in that final quarter of 2021. So, they were expecting the cat to get out of the bag at that point, and then people wouldn't take the jab. So they incentivized the physician. So now we have, the fake pandemic, we have a fake virus, we have hospital murders that were created to promote the fear porn so they could get the vaccine in everybody's arm. And then you have a vaccine that was never a vaccine. It was a bioweapon to start with. The Brooke Jackson case proved that. She worked for Pfizer. She knew that they didn't do any testing. So she files a false claims act against Pfizer. Their response was to produce an other authority agreement with the Department of Defense that said this was a prototype, so no testing was required. So this thing was never designed to be a vaccine. So anyway, that's I don't even remember your initial question, but I answered a piece of it, I think. But I think you asked, has this been going on for systemically for a long period of time? And the answer to that is absolutely. COVID exposed that, but what I dug into is I had a cursory knowledge of Satan before COVID, and I dug into the satanic agenda and how integrated all the pieces of what has been put in place. With the people who have sold, they're sold directly, the Illuminati, but then you start going down to the secret societies and how have they put all of this in place to be able to pull off this lie that has been sold that the planet doesn't have enough resources, so consequently we only can have 500 million people. We've got to control the climate. God told us, be fruitful and multiply, and God gave us everything that we need to be successful on this earth. And but the big lies that have been sold are being implemented with a vengeance. And he's had 6,000 years to lay the framework, and COVID exposed it for those who are awake.
Remarkable. So let me take us then in a direction that brings us to some more recent history, because I think the context and the longitudinal understanding over, say, the last 30 years or the last 40 years is really important and is going to help a lot of folks out there as they piece these things together. Can you take us through your research from, say, the mid-1980s, early 1990s till now on how medical murder was made legal, on how these regulatory agencies, licensing boards, associations, et cetera, sort of acted in lockstep and were positioned over a period of decades, not weeks or months, but over a period of decades to allow for the seamless transition through this process that we saw, as you correctly described, publicly exposed with the agenda of COVID-19?
I'll hit a few things from memory. I don't have anything up on my screen right now, but I did put together a series called Medical Murder is the #1 Cause of Death in the United States by Design. It is on Grace's main website, which is ouramazinggrace.net. It's the reason it's a 7-part series is because it's a big topic. So I went through who, what, where, why, when, how, and now what. So those 7 parts are all documented on Rumble, and the series is posted on the website. But a few things just to connect the dots with your question. This started, the best document that you could look at would be the Vaccine Safety Act from 1986, because that gave immunity to the people making vaccines. They got immunity from liability for any downstream consequences of vaccines. Well, how is that even possible? I own a business, SG. If I had the government put in place legislation to exempt me from any liability for anything I did, I mean, that violates God's laws of choice and consequence. So, I mean, they have no reason whatsoever, because they have immunity from liability. They have no reason whatsoever to do any research, testing, or anything relative to their products. So that's the biggie. I mentioned Obamacare previously. Look at section 1553 of Obamacare. Anybody listening, look at that section. That section is titled non-discrimination, or you can't, I can't think of the title right now, but the purpose of it is to provide the government cannot discriminate against any physician or hospital facility or any healthcare facility from not implementing euthanasia, mercy killing, and assisted suicide. So we point our fingers at the Canadian-made medical assistance in dying program. Well, we were first to the punch. Section 1553, March 23rd of 2010, documents the MAID program in the United States by calling out specifically, if a doctor doesn't want to participate in that program, he cannot be discriminated against. Well, what's interesting about that specific situation is if he is discriminated against, his appeal is to the Health and Human Services Secretary. And that's where it really gets nefarious. Yeah, Congress is all in on this. Congress allowed, through legislation, the Health and Human Services Secretary to have unilateral authority as to when a public health emergency could be implemented. So in January of 2020, the Health and Human Services Secretary implemented the public health emergency in the United States. By law, he has to re-up that every 90 days. So he kept re-upping it for 39 months in a row. Well, the public health emergency, once that public health emergency is implemented, that gives him the authority to implement the PrEP Act. Well, the PrEP Act gave immunity from liability for murdering people in the hospital. Well, then the PrEP Act, then with the PrEP Act in place, that facilitated the FDA to issue emergency use authorization tools and drugs for COVID. So what they did with COVID, and by the way, these are still going on. This has nothing, Congress illegally ended COVID on April 10th of 2023, and nothing stopped. These incentives, the emergency use authorizations are still going on. So they authorized remdesivir with a 75% kill rate. The FDA did through emergency use authorization, and ventilators with a 90% kill rate. So here's a statistic that it's so hard to wrap your head around this. And then you can see what God told us is going to happen. In Revelation 18:23, he said that the Mystery Babylon is going to deceive the world with its pharmakia. Well, I think the United States is Mystery Babylon. Well, when I give you this statistic, during the 39 months that I call the COVID era, 1.2 million Americans were murdered in hospitals. All right, so that number may seem high, low, indifferent, but you got to compare it to who is number two. There's 200 countries on the planet. United States, number one in the entire world with hospital murders, 1.2 million. Number two had 531,000 murders, so less than 50%. Yet number two's population is 4 times that of the United States. 4 times that of the United States. And number two is India. So when you see that statistic on its own, you know something happened. And what happened is the series of laws that Congress implemented since 1986 allowed the T's to be crossed and the I's dotted. And I want to go through something very specific that people really don't understand. Now that we filed the lawsuit, I have dug into legislation in a very detailed level. And how they pull this off, you cannot sue these doctors. So when your loved one is murdered in the hospital, the state statutes make it near impossible to sue. Well, what am I talking about? Well, they have limitations on liability. They want to put everything in medical malpractice. They limit the attorney fee to 1/3 of the state statutory limit. So no attorneys will take on the case because there's no money in these cases. But then what they do through statute is they protect the doctor. So in Wisconsin, which is the state that Grace died in, which is where we're still from, they have a informed consent statute. All 50 states are going to have this. I'm just very familiar with Wisconsin because of our lawsuit. The informed consent statute lays out what the doctor is responsible for relative to informed consent. And if you read it, you think, well, that's logical. Well, take a step back. The state constitution says the legislature shall make no ex post facto law, no law against the person's right to life. So when they pass a law like this, it is taking away a right. And this is how they do it. The informed consent law, if you want to go to God's law, is treat your neighbor as yourself. So SG, if you're a doctor, wouldn't you just want all of your patients to know what's going on? You would want them educated. so that they know what the choice, the consequences, you'd want them educated. Well, that's not what's happening. So they put a state statute in place to define informed consent. You read it, it's logical. But when you have a complaint against the doctor, and I found this out because I wrote a formal complaint against the doctor, and a pharmacist wrote a formal complaint against the same doctor, a 100-page complaint. Well, when you file a complaint, the state statute calls out your complaint goes to the medical examining board, which is made up of 10 doctors and 3 lay people. So this is like the traffic cop giving his buddy a ticket. It's not going to happen. And both myself and the pharmacist who filed the complaint got form letters back from the medical examining board, said the doctor did no wrong. I mean, think through this. He put a med combination that would have killed anybody, you, I, and anybody listening, and put an illegal do not resuscitate order on my daughter's chart. Yet the medical examining board comes back and says he does no wrong. That's how corrupt this is, and how detailed and intricate the plans have been put in place so that this satanic battle, the only way to win this is God's got to be behind it. That's how elaborate the plans are.
This is absolutely incredible and helps to paint, I think, a very formal, well-presented picture for the people out there to understand that these circular locuses of power and control self-insulate themselves, right? You have individuals, CEOs of very large hospital associations, all of a sudden they are now members of the state hospital board or the state medical licensing board. The same is true at the national level with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, a former vice president of Pfizer Corporation. And for a time during the pandemic era, the 39-month period that you described, he was actually one of the commissioners for the FDA itself, the regulatory agency designed to supposedly protect the population from malfeasance, profiteering, greed and corruption, sidestepping quality of research and safety at that health level. And so I want to say, first off, I really appreciate the perspective that you're offering. And I have a question. You said you mentioned a lawsuit. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how that's playing out without compromising any details?
Well, praise God, the legal team, they know I'm outspoken, and they have been really a blessing. And they're encouraging me. There's nothing they said I can't say. So it's fantastic. So we have a 4-person legal team, 3 different firms. And we had promised God when we jumped into the ring that whatever door you open, we'll walk through. So this door opened and we're walking through it. We're funding our own case. And because you have to, no attorney's going to take this on a percentage because there's no money in these cases. So anyway, that being said, we have a civil case in the county that Grace was murdered in. We eventually believe we will have a criminal case. Time will tell. I mean, the legal team wants to get this civil case to the point that we can use the same information for the criminal case later on as we proceed. So we filed the case on April 11th of 2023. What happened after we filed is the defense, which we sued not only the hospital, but we sued 5 doctors and 2 nurses. And the reason we did that is it's a much more expensive case, but a hospital did not pull the trigger. The hospital received incentives from the government through doing all kinds of nefarious things, mainly through Medicare and Medicaid. That's why I say this has been going on for a long time. The US government has controlled the entire medical industrial complex through Medicare and Medicaid way before COVID. So the hospital, of course, is guilty, but they didn't pull the trigger. So the 5 doctors and 2 nurses who were directly involved with Grace's death, we also sued. You can imagine it makes it a more expensive case because now we have multiple attorneys, we've got multiple depositions. It's a big case. Ultimately, they all responded on May 15th by law, and there were 2 motions to dismiss as part of those responses. The judge heard the motions to dismiss on July 14th. He didn't allow either of them to go forward. In fact, what he did is he set the first jury trial in the entire country. So we have the first jury trial. The first day of the jury trial is November 4th of 2024. That's the day before the presidential election. I was just doing some research before you and I got on today because the Republican National Convention is in Wisconsin this year. So I'm planning on participating. given that I'll have an opportunity to talk about Grace's story with people at the convention. Anyway, so he sets the jury trial. So he thought, boy, that's huge. We have the first jury trial in the country for somebody murdered during the COVID era. So then what happened is, because we learned at the July 14th hearing that they attempt, and when I say they, I'm talking about the legislature and the cabal controlled medical industrial complex. They tried to put every single thing that happens in a hospital underneath the umbrella of medical malpractice. And the reason is because there's state statutory limits to when you can file and the amount of the claim. So the judge asked our legal team, or well, he didn't ask, I mean, judges don't ask, but he told our legal team to file an amended complaint to call out the medical battery portion of our complaint separately. So we did that. We filed that amended complaint on July 28th. That set a firestorm in place, 2 more motions to dismiss, because nobody wants a medical battery on the defense because their insurance doesn't cover it. Plus it exposes a different level. Medical malpractice.
Willful harm.
Exactly. Medical malpractice means an accident, right? This was not an accident. So they filed 2 more motions to dismiss. The judge heard those motions on October 30th, and he denied them both. So our entire case, including the medical battery component, is proceeding to jury trial, 3-week jury trial starting November 4th. So, I mean, we are ecstatic about that. This does not mean the judge is for us. It means the judge is following the rule of law. And I can read a couple of things out of our brief in opposition. I think that would be helpful if you'd like me to.
Yes, please.
Well, what I like about the brief in opposition is that we laid out some facts. So these become public documents. I have this document on Grace's website because I think every single person should be using this strategy with any medical malpractice case right now today. So what they did first is they laid out what the judge has to follow if he's going to follow the rule of law. So they wrote, quote, "In analyzing the motions, the court should accept all allegations in plaintiff's amended complaint as true. The complaint is only insufficient if it appears to be a certainty that no relief can be granted under any set of facts which plaintiff could prove." So that sets out the rule of law. We should have a right to a jury trial because the burden of proof is on the plaintiff, me, to prove what our case is. So the judge agreed with the rule of law. He didn't try to rule from the bench. Well, then what they did, this paragraph should be in every single complaint against a medical facility going forward. So what they wrote is they distinguished a battery from lack of informed consent. So, quote, "Imagine a physician who fails to fully inform a patient about the risks of a leg amputation, but the patient does agree to have his leg amputated. This violates the duty to obtain informed consent under state statute. Now imagine a physician who amputates a patient's leg without obtaining consent or telling the patient or the patient's family what he is doing. And in this case, removing the patient's power of attorney and parent from the hospital first. This is a battery." So you see what they did is they defined medical battery separate from lack of informed consent. And this was brilliant because this is what we needed to have the judge agree with dismissing the complaints. And then last but not least, and this paragraph really defines what is happening in a hospital setting. So I'm going to quote again, quote, "Defendants want this court to rule that a patient with Down syndrome can be intentionally restrained, intentionally deprived of advocacy, and intentionally administered deadly sedatives, all without consent. And these actions are simple medical negligence. Subsuming battery under medical malpractice in such a way would make hospitals walled gardens where any intentional misconduct would be treated as simple negligence. Indeed, defendants envision a world where there is no common law claim for the failure of a healthcare provider to obtain consent that falls outside of medical malpractice. In this world, an unethical or financially motivated physician may administer deadly drugs without consent for malign purposes, including making room for new patients. So that language is all in our brief in opposition. The judge, praise God, he didn't, he accepted our brief in opposition and denied the motions to dismiss. So the whole case is going forward.
Incredible news, and very exciting and hopeful news as we look to see what types of legal movings, right? What types of gears working within this judiciary here in the United States, which we know a great deal of it is captured, but there are still holdouts, right? There are still those that are interested in upholding the rule of law. There are still those judges, those juries that wish to see recompense and reconciliation with the population, of the United States and of all Western nation states and nations that were affected through this launch of what amounts to a global depopulation plan, but carried out expertly and, as you pointed out, very elegantly and clandestinely at the community level. If I may, Mr. Schara, in closing, can you give us some thoughts about where you think this is going to go and what people can do to assist, how people can get a hold of you, donate, et cetera, maybe perhaps citizen report on these types of things? How would all of that play out?
Well, I'll start with how they can help out. We started a separate website, grayschara.com. Schara is Schara, and the purpose of that website is for people to follow the story. We're asking simply for your name and email address. If you want to donate, certainly you can. That is not our priority. Our priority is to create a database of people so that as we have calls to action, we can get a hold of the individuals following the story. And we believe there's going to be calls to action. I mean, I can sense that there's a lot of rumblings already about our case. This will be a trailblazing case. Not only will the statute of limitations change, because the statute of limitations with medical malpractice is anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on the state. And in general, it doubles with battery. So that's exciting. In addition, the limitations on what the maximum damage claim is for medical malpractice completely go out the window. So there's no limitation for a battery claim. So that's trailblazing. So that's how people can help. I'd really appreciate if anybody listening would simply go. It takes 10 seconds to put in your name and email address, and that adds to our database of those following. What can people do? I think the most important thing that COVID did was to expose where things are at. I believe in the God of the Bible, and I think his judgment is overdue. I think he gave us a very strong warning with COVID to repent. And I say that confidently because we got at this period of time, all of us, by rejecting God. We relied on man to save us. The medical industrial complex is because of our own laziness and not wanting to take responsibility and rely on God we want to rely on vaccines instead of God, just as, to play off the vaccine agenda. So he's calling us to repentance. I think that, God's timeline, I'm not a prophet. I don't know what his timeline is, but my sense is that time is urgent. And it's time to get right with God, repent, and then stand firm. Once you have repented, it's time to stand firm. And so what does that look like? We know what they did. We know the playbook, and the playbook is being repeated, as they're doing RSV, Disease X, all that. They're going to keep replaying that playbook. But, what's the next level? What are they going to play next? The food shortages, the, power outages, there's going to be umpteen things to cause fear. And God did not give us a spirit of fear. The fear in my case is why my daughter Grace is not here anymore. That fear led me to take her to the hospital, and I don't want anybody to succumb to that spirit of fear anymore. And that's how we resist evil. Evil is resisted by not succumbing to the fear. And so that's my recommendation.
Powerful and true. If we look at what's happening in the world right now, it is absolutely a spiritual reclamation. It is a spiritual return worldwide. We, the people, knowing, of course, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, understanding that there is a much broader almighty force that divines us all, and it makes all things possible, right? In which we can rely upon and resource in times of shortage and fall upon, as Christ has discussed, did discuss multiple times. And I think that is the essence of where all of these things are headed. And I appreciate you bringing that up in our closing discussion here, because the events that are happening in cases such as yours and cases elsewhere around the world, in the Costa Rican judiciary, in the Mexican judiciary, other cases that are moving through the due process in the United States, despite the colossal Leviathan level of resistance, fear, recusal, etc., from these types of issues in an effort to not draw attention to them, it is producing a spiritual transformation. And this transformation will reverberate across our judiciary, across our institutions, across our bureaucracy, across all levers of government and all levels of government everywhere. And I thank you very much, my friend, for the things that you're doing, and my sincere condolences to you on your loss in this battle and in this journey as we move forward. I'm so grateful to be here with you. Everyone, this is SG Anon. I hope you've appreciated our discussion today. If you seek to get a hold of Mr. Schara and his team, you can go to graceschara.com. You can also go to ouramazinggrace.net, which is an incredible resource for medical malpractice, what defines a medical murder, in things that have occurred over these last few years, MK Ultra programming, etc. It is well worth your time. Mr. Schara, thank you for being here today. God bless. And everyone, this is SG Anon. I'll be back with each of you again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.